Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the museum for this, the final of our 4 UCL Lunchtime Lectures. I'm going to hand you over in a moment to David Saunders, our Head of Conservation and Scientific Research here at the museum, to introduce our speaker. But before I do, if I could just remind you, if you have a mobile phone with you, if you could turn it to silent, we'd be very grateful. Thank you. I'll hand you over to David.
Well, thank you, Dan. And as Dan said, I'm David Saunders, Keeper of Conservation and Scientific Research here at the British Museum. And I'd like to add my welcome to this last of the Lunch Hour Lectures on tour here at the British Museum. I gather that these will start up again in the autumn back at UCL, but for now it's the final in 4 lectures that are being given here at the British Museum. And a very great pleasure to introduce Libby Sheldon, with whom I've worked over a number of years in her role at University College, teaching material studies to art history students. And this has been, the idea of this has been to introduce them to the material aspects of paintings, to understand them more as just images and metaphors, but also to understand that they have a material existence and how that material existence began and how it will take them into the future. And of course, Libby has the added advantage that she gets to work on things outside a collection, and therefore things come to her that have been hidden away and which often prove to have a very elusive history. And we sometimes get asked whether a lot of our work in the analysis of objects and materials is about finding fakes, forgeries, reattributing things. And sadly, a lot of our work isn't like that. But Libby gets to see these things that have been in attics or that have been hidden away. And so it's a very challenging field of study for her. Sadly, Libby is going to be retiring from the post of teaching undergraduates in the field from this year onwards. But I was very pleased to learn today that although she's not going to be responsible for the teaching of the course anymore, she is going to be a fellow, a research fellow in the department. So she will be able to continue that contact with the objects and to continue as a colleague working with the rest of us. It might seem a little strange that someone who's so involved with paintings is speaking in the British Museum, which has a notable lack of a painting collection. But we do have painted objects here, and it's a particularly good moment to be thinking about paintings, and especially as Libby's going to focus on today, some of the paintings from the Elizabethan period, because as many of you may know, on the 19th of July we open an exhibition here about the life and times of Shakespeare, and it will feature a number of paintings drawn from the national collections and private collections in the UK to illustrate that. So that Libby has chosen to make that one of the topics of her presentation this afternoon is a very good piece of timing. So I won't take up the podium any longer. Please welcome Libby Sheldon.
Thank you, David. Looking down the microscope at works of art, as David well knows, is always a joy and a voyage of discovery. And today, to me, it's as glamorous as underwater diving, underwater exploration, because you're entering another world when you look down the microscope. This shows a microscopic looking at Elizabethan painting and the materials of painters, and those are my main research interests, actually looking down the microscope at paintings and discovering about the painter's practice. Now, frequently the microscopist will reach an intimacy, a level of intimacy with paintings, which and discover a closeness with a work of art which nobody else has seen, or you're the first one, which like Jacques Cousteau going underwater, discovering wonderful exotic fish. I hope to show you some of the things that I've found on paintings by this means. And this is the sort of intimacy that we reach when looking down the microscope at paint with simple microscope, not anything very fancy, at about times 90, looking at the surface of a painting, of a Tudor painting. Both looking at paint like this and looking at samples of paint, which I'm going to be showing you a little bit later, gives us crucial information about the painter's practice, and also about the condition of the paint. As you can see here, there are all sorts of damages to the paint. But then it's only after looking at the condition that we can actually find out about the way the painter has put on the paint and also what sort of workshop might have produced it, what sort of pigments, what sort of materials have been used, so that this is a crucial bit of research. It's called technical art history, which is a rather dull name for it, but it's related strongly to archaeology, to the methods of archaeology, but also it sort of has this. It's a little bit like detective work in many senses, and it involves a good degree of interpretation. So it's a marriage really of science and art, and one can't look at samples or look at a painting through a microscope or in cross-section without knowing about the context of this paint. So, for instance, with this work of Quintin Masses from a private collection, which I had to look at, it was very interesting to be able to compare it with what we know about Masses and what we know about the period. And the painting of the artist at work shows us what sort of brushes he used, the fineness of the brush, and it indeed shows us that he was using oil paint, or the oil medium rather than egg tempera. On the table there's a little pot, presumably containing oil. I can just point to here. But more critically, crucially, this palette only came in when, of course, a viscous enough medium was being used, and that medium is oil. So you don't get a palette with egg tempera painters. And so that's this sort of information, that it's a painting of St. Luke. We assume that it gives some idea about the way the painter was painting this work, and a cross-section from that will show us the way he worked under the surface. We might be able to see what he's doing on the surface in that painting, but under the surface we can see that he used a chalk ground to begin with, then primed it with a light, very pale imprimatura, then put an underlayer of grey, either for economy, so that the blue azurite on top doesn't take up too much pigment, or to give a cool tone to that painting of the Virgin, and then 2 layers of thick azurite. And this is, we see at times 4,000. This is taken from the very edge of a painting. It's a tiny speck of paint that's almost invisible to the naked eye, so very, very small. But if we look at times 1,000 under the microscope, we can see hidden things that are hidden to the naked eye, even hidden at times 400. This is Crimson Lake, a beautiful translucent organic pigment that's been mixed into the azurite. And that's probably because the artist was trying to achieve this extraordinary blue here, which looks like ultramarine. Ultramarine much more expensive in the north of Europe. So Quintin Masses probably using this trick of mixing in, as many northern painters did, of using a lake in the pigment. So it's this balance that the painter had to strike between practical purpose and aesthetic purpose in choosing his materials or her materials becomes very obvious when you're looking at paint at this level. I just have to issue an apology because some of you will have seen the publicity for this and be hoping that I'm going to be talking about a Van Gogh that I looked at some years ago. But I'm afraid to say that I'm not, and you're free to leave the lecture theatre now if that's what you're hoping. I've been seduced by looking at a whole lot of paintings, 16th century paintings, and I hope that you'll find them as exciting as I do by the end. I think that the sorts of pigments that we're finding is just as large a range of pigments. And of course, looking at paintings like Van Gogh, I use exactly the same process. I look at, we look at the brush strokes, probably the layers of painting, the way it's been put on, the palette, and indeed the degree of degradation. We know that Van Gogh used a pigment that's a red crimson lake that's disappeared from many of his paintings because it's faded. So some of those sorts of methods are going to be applied to these paintings. And why I've been focusing on this area is because of a major project of research. And this is one of many that are starting up in this area of technical art history. It's a wide open field for research. This is at the National Portrait Gallery, and it's looking at paintings from all sorts of points of view, through X-ray and ultraviolet and infrared, showing the underdrawing, dendrochronology, looking at the tree ring of the panel to date it by. And it's these two that I've been concerned with, looking at the painting first of all, although others in the team also share this work or do a lot of it, and then taking samples where it's possible, and taking them back to the lab in UCL and having a look at them, and sometimes having to use more sophisticated analysis. But on the whole, most of the analysis is relatively simple, traditional, old-fashioned, and unlike Matthias's talk last week about books, it's actually invasive. But I hope I can persuade you that I'm using invasive analysis and taking samples in a justifiable way. In the future, I guess this will be redundant, this form of analysis, when we can look at every layer of paint from the surface. What I do at the moment is set samples either as dispersions on slides to look at just the pigment, or as cross-sections, so I can look at all the layers. But of course, preliminary to that is always looking very closely at the surface. And it's partly to look at the condition, of course, but also to find out whether something like this blue on the eye of King Edward is actually a retouching or is original. And we could see under the microscope that it was azurite, which is a pigment from the period, and also that it didn't disappear into the cracks as it would if it was applied later when the cracks had formed. That's useful, but we're also getting all sorts of information from the painting at the same time. Oh, sorry, turned the thing round. And it's the intimacy with paintings that is visible at high magnification. And in fact, one can see the fingerprint of the painting, literally see the fingerprint of the painter in some paintings. And if you look at the edge here, these are photographs of this area here. I think you might be able to see these little lines here, which are the impressions of the finger onto a red lake, onto a translucent red that's been put over, that's been glazed over the solid red underneath to enhance it. Now, why would the painter do that? One reason might be because it's difficult to get, sometimes to spread a glaze. It's a lot of oil and only a little pigment, and to spread it evenly so the pigment is nicely even over the surface. We think that maybe that's the reason why they did that. But another reason might be that this is a beautiful enamel surface, very, very lovely and smooth. And it might be to match down this area so that it's a nice contrast, a nice textural contrast to that enamel finish. But we don't know, and those are sorts of questions that this type of research raises. So looking closely at paintings can tell us about the methods of painters, the way they worked, and also about the materials that they used. This portrait is a very small size. It's about the size of a playing card. It's a miniature painting. So we wondered what the blue was around here, because as I was saying, blue is ultramarine is very expensive. What was this? Was it azurite? Was it the same as the massis, the Puente massis? We can see on this actually a lot of other interesting information. I don't know if you can see, apart from the cracking, the horizontal cracking, on this tiny panel. It's on a panel, little panel. And the cracking is horizontal, which implies that the board is horizontal. But then you can also see here the drawing of the nose, which is showing through. Paint always becomes more translucent with time. I'm sure you're aware of that. But and some paint shows more readily this sort of underdrawing. You can see it in the moustache and around the lips and so on. But also, we can see this blue. And if we have a look even at a closer level, we might be able to decide whether it's ultramarine or smalt. When it's first put on, smalt was very, very similar in colour to ultramarine. And I don't suppose, I wouldn't be able to tell if you just showed me those two without any information. I certainly wouldn't be able to tell which was which. So when it was first put on, it was a magnificent colour. And you can see that although it was about, at one stage in the late 16th century, it was 100 times cheaper than ultramarine to buy for the painter. But the painter in this case has used this, which is smalt. This is natural ultramarine, lapis lazuli. And here we can see it's smalt. We can tell it's smalt without sampling it, just by looking at it on the surface, because it's been combed in this way. Even a higher magnification, you can see these striations in it. And this is because this was a blue that was a very, very difficult paint to handle, just like the glaze, the red glaze. It was almost impossible to put it on with a brush. The students have tried various methods of reconstructing it and handling it. And it was called strewing blue in Holland because one method of putting it on would be to lay a layer of oil or a layer of oil with white in it and then literally throw this glassy cobalt pigment onto the surface. And so that it then might be fairly. And when we tried this, it was very, very patchy. But as soon as you combed it with a very fine comb, then it evened it out and made it spread more into a better even surface. So we'll come back to this seductive robe of a pigment a bit later. This is. Another method of combing, which we saw again just through the microscope, looking at the surface, and this is used to give the sense here on this pillar, the stone pillar, of sort of the veining in a marble pillar, and you can't really see that by eye. It's only under the microscope that you can see that. So we come to the question of whether these sorts of marks were visible, or whether they were perceived by the eye, and whether they were perceived without awareness, but perceived to a degree that would give you the effect that the artist wanted, and whether the artists themselves were working with that in mind. Or were they working with the connoisseur in mind, who might have had magnification to look at paintings and to admire these extraordinarily delicate and intricate techniques? This is a period, so we know that there were people with glasses or magnification of some sort. But this detail of an eye from this portrait here is certainly not visible on the surface. Even with my glasses on, I couldn't see it. But it shows the artist. You might think that's a mistake. You might think that that's it's just where the brush where he's drawn the brush off quickly from the paint surface. But when you look at the precision of the eye there and the little bit of yellow in the corner of the eye, I'm absolutely sure that this is deliberate, as are my colleagues at the National Portrait Gallery. And I think it will give the impression, even if we can't see it on the surface, of movement in the eye and of life in the eye. So again, it's very interesting to see that degree of sophistication in terms of optics and perception. Now, there are problems with looking at paintings on the surface. And one of them is to do with what's on the surface. And this is a layer of very heavily discolored varnish. And it comes from a painting that I was asked to look at for the conservator. And you might have seen this in the news. It was a recently restored painting from the Dulwich Picture Gallery. And it's these are just straps to hold it onto. It's a big painting onto the conservator's easel. And she asked me to take various samples from around the edges because they were believed to be later. And indeed, you can see they've been taken away because they were a good deal later, 18th century editions. But that sample came from around here, where you can see that conservators made tests in the painting, and it was covered with this thick varnish. So it was almost impossible to see this very interesting yellow, which is a hybrid lead-based yellow, which we've only come across quite rarely. And the National Gallery has written an article about it and done some research, and we think that painters used it in the south of Italy and in Rome particularly. So that helps in attributing a painting like this. The materials can often give us some clues about attribution and about date, because that pigment certainly wouldn't have been used in the 18th century. It became obsolete around 1700. This is a different covering of the surface, and this sample, it's the same sample, but this is a thin section through this sample with transmitted light, so we can see it more clearly. And I think I've probably just cut that off. I'm sorry. There's a green table here. You can perhaps see it here. And this is and covered with 2 layers of overpaint. In this ordinary view, you can't actually see very well what the layers are above. It looks just brownish and sort of mixed greenish brown. This is the original layer. So this in here, this is the dark, a beautiful copper resonate green glaze, a lovely pure green, like gin bottle green, on top of the priming there. So this table would originally have been a lovely dark green. But on top of it, there's a first repaint. There must have been some damage to it, but they've gone over original paint. And then a second retouching there. This is smalt and an organic yellow, and smalt changes colour, and that's then gone brown. So the second restorer decided it was brown as is mixed a whole lot of greens and reds and yellows to make a brown on top of that. So really, when we're looking at that, we had to be aware of those sorts of additions to the painting. Now, taking samples, it is an invasive technique, but they are samples of pigment. Just the pigment can be 2 or 3 grains worth of paint, so that it's not, it won't be visible to the naked eye. And these 2 paintings had been looked at by my colleagues at the National Portrait Gallery, and dendrochronology by Ian Towers had found that they were very closely linked from the same workshop. They've been attributed to the miniature painter, painter normally known for his miniatures, Nicholas Hilliard. The paintings in large, and they're both closely related to each other in terms of, you can see the pattern of the faces. If you reverse them, they would be exactly the same. And all sorts of X-rays and infrareds all pointed towards them being from the same workshop. And my little contribution to this was to look at the pigments and find an astonishingly bright green, one that I hadn't seen before on paintings of this period. This research has been going on for 5 years, so we've seen a lot of paintings over the period. There are other greens, verdigris and mixed greens, azurite and yellow lake, but this didn't look like any of them. So I took a tiny sample and found under polarizing light microscope, which I use a great deal for identifying pigments, that it was green verditer. Now, green verditer, if you read Nicholas Hilliard's treatise on miniature painting, he says is not to be used. It's one of the foul pigments that he doesn't want used in paintings. But perhaps on this occasion, he wanted something special in Elizabeth's costume, and he's used it in both paintings, funnily enough, but only on tiny touches. It's just in this part here of that painting, and in the rose of leaves of the rose on the fingers. So a very judicial use of this pigment. And that was a dispersion. These cross-sections are sometimes necessary, but only when we can find a crack or some sort of loss to get at the painting, to see the edge of it. And here, this, by the way, is not my hole. This is a loss, and my sample was taken at the very edge of that. And although it looks huge here, it's actually a speck like a speck of dust. But it's from this area here. So the red of the fan, that's the red of fan and her flesh there, and then the pearl here. But this red here, it shows the pale grey of the priming layer, and then vermilion. And on the top, there is these traces of crimson lake greys which aren't visible on the surface. Very, very difficult to see. So from any point of view, a conservation point of view, to know that that layer is there, or traces of that layer there, is terribly important, because that's could be mixed with a resin, perhaps, as well as an oil to spread it better. So it might be vulnerable to the sort of solvents. So I feel that in that sense that cross-section is sometimes justified, but also the fact that we can look for it now in other places on the painting. under the microscope. Now, if I'd been using a non-invasive technique, and there's a PhD student working in the History of Art department with this portable XRF, which is a non-invasive mode, it's held up against the painting without actually, it looks as though it's touching here, but it isn't. And what it would show is the elements in these layers. So it would show in this aluminium from the alum, which my colleague mentioned last week as in paper, used in paper. Well, it's used in dyes, of course, and this is basically a dye used as a pigment, but precipitated onto alum. So you might pick up aluminium, you pick up mercury and sulfur from this, lead from that, and probably chalk from the underlying layer. But you wouldn't know which layer those were in. So you get them all together on the computer that's on the back of this wonderful instrument. So it's going towards non-invasive analysis, but I probably will outlive the redundancy of invasive sampling. And then, so of course, we can then look for Crimson Lake in other parts of the painting. This is detail of Elizabeth's first shoes standing on top of Ditchley somewhere around here, which is why it's called a Ditchley portrait. And it was made for her visit to Ditchley. And Red Lake is certainly on these, we can see it on these bits here, the organic red on top of the solid red. Sometimes we don't need to take a sample, or we think we don't. This is at the edge. This looks like a cross-section, but it's actually just looking at the edge where it's exposed when the frame comes off the painting. And there's all the layers, the carpet, the red carpet, and then there's this azurite blue and chalk. But was the azurite a pentiment? Was it something that was covered over by red? Here's some azurite in the carpet. This is from the carpet around here. Or was it underneath the whole painting? We took other samples. I took samples from this edge and under here and one somewhere in the middle here. And all of them was this layer of azurite. Now, expensive azurite, used as an imprimatur, used as a priming layer underneath all the paint, underneath this whole painting, and only used very, very slightly. Sometimes you can see it under the painting. Why? Why use that expensive pigment under that? There is also another expensive item, silver, underneath his clothing. So is it to give value, hidden value, but value to the painting by including these materials, these expensive materials in the painting, even though you can't see them? Would the sitter have known? Would people have known that material was in there? Or is it an optical effect, or is it to give the maximum coolness to the face and to the lighter areas of the painting? The interesting thing about this was, though we hadn't found it in any other painting and haven't still, and I'd love to hear anybody who has found this used as a priming layer. We did find it in one other painting which has been attributed to the same workshop as Edward VI, and this is Catherine Parr. And you can see why perhaps this might be an optical reason, her beautiful pale face. And again, she's got silver in her costume. But it is very odd, and this is such superior azurite as well. It's not just bog standard sort of azurite. So it's an interesting question. Including expensive materials. This is, I'm sorry I haven't got the whole thing, but you can see this at the National Portrait Gallery. All of these paintings I'm showing are at the National Portrait Gallery, unless I've so put otherwise. And this is silver underneath the Red Lake glaze. And you can see when you look closely under the microscope, smalt, lovely coloured smalt in the collar to make the collar, here it comes over here, collar, a lovely cool colour, and then here is silver. Now, what we wondered was whether the silver went under the whole painting, or whether it was silver, ground-up silver, or whether it's silver leaf. So a cross-section of that at the very edge of the painting showed that it was, in reflected light, we could see the silver leaf along here, and then shadowing on top and the red glaze. So where there was light, in the lighter areas, it's the silver that's giving light to the modelling. And that would have been probably much more visible when the painting was originally done. Silver has been used on this same painting that I showed you earlier of Nicholas Hilliard's on these rubies in her arm. We looked for other instances of little silver highlight used like this, and I've never seen it before, silver highlights. Silver uses a highlight rather than the blob of little lead white. But you can see how very small it must be on that. We couldn't see it with the naked eye. So again, a little effect, perhaps a glittery effect on the jewel that you would be aware of. But this brings me to another section of this talk, which is to think about condition, because there were several other rubies around on her costume, and we could see very tiny traces of silver, where silver might have been, but they'd gone. So we're lucky to find this one here, because that gives us some information. But the deterioration of paintings is something we need to know about, and of course, these are either interferences, as we saw earlier with the overpaint, or their the hand of time in giving us, making changes in the painting. And here we've got a painting of Elizabeth I, and now she has a rose in her hand, but it's badly interfered with by this thinning of the paint, and we can begin to see what's visible, clearly visible in infrared, which is a serpent of the original painting. And there are other parts of this painting that have changed. This was an original painting, perhaps of somebody else. Perhaps suddenly they were having a visit from Elizabeth, whoever was commissioned this painting, and thought they better use the nearest panel, which was of a relative or something. I don't know, but it's quite a radical change. But this change, and we don't know why it was done, but we wondered whether it was later or not. So I took a sample from down here through the paint of the serpent, and that's the paint of the serpent. But either side of it is exactly the same mixture of 5 or 6 pigments, and so we think that this was covered over by the artist. It would be very difficult to get that same mixture. So a decision by the artist or by the patron, perhaps even Elizabeth saw it and said, "I don't want that horrible snake on my hand." Serpent. We don't know what the significance of the serpent would be. There's only one other portrait with her holding a serpent. And I'm just throwing this in really to show you that I do something other than 16th century paintings, and this came from the National Portrait Gallery as well. They've just restored it, and before restoration, the conservator asked me what these were in the paint here, little glass-like protuberances in the hair. And was it some later interference, or was it something degrading? And the cross section of that showed this extraordinary what is a silicaceous ball, possibly quartz, laid onto the paint. At the same time, this end of the sample is magnified here, and we could see that there was extraordinary layer structure here, and a very thin layer of varnish over one layer, and we wondered what on earth this red was doing. Why was that under the hair? And this is the paint of the hair, a mixture of pigments. But then at the same time, for the conservation process, it was X-rayed, and the conservator told me that this was a portrait, a self-portrait, and you can see it's exactly the same, and then abandoned and turned over and used for a second portrait, a second attempt at it. Why? I've been speculating that perhaps he gave himself a red cravat at first and then decided he wanted a blue cravat instead. I don't know, but it seems extraordinary to reach that level of finish and turn it over. But painters did for economy or for experimental or for other reasons. A very common form of deterioration can be seen here, and this is fading of pigments, exposure to light. This is underneath the frame rebate, which has preserved the lake. And this would have originally been a lovely red colour, and that a beautiful blue, azurite blue. But time has changed. Time has changed that. And we don't know how aware painters were of the effects of time and whether they would have covered paintings over. But again, here you can see indigo fading. It's preserved under rebate, but not fading on this portrait of Cromwell. Was he using a better quality indigo? The yellow lake has faded on the top of that cross-section of it would have been a much greener affair. And we come back to this rogue pigment, smalt. Beautiful when it's first used. Occasionally it survives in good form, as you saw in the Prince of Wales picture. But here it's deteriorated in the background, and the National Portrait Gallery has attempted some sort of digital reconstruction of the sort of colour that would have been in the background there. We know that some painters in the 17th century were aware of the fading of smalt, dirty smalt, he calls it. I think the most interesting fading, and this is my final look at these paintings, is with this outline to the embroidery on the dress, which we thought might be just bulked out with colourless smalt, which sometimes is used to bulk out painting for this effect of embroidery. But we could see occasionally a particle of a strong blue. And Marika Spring at the National Gallery did actually look at my sample from these outlines in embroidery, and found that the blue was originally a strong blue. So that would have been crimson lake and a strong blue to form purple outlines to the yellow embroidery, which makes a huge difference to our thinking about this painting and our reading of the symbolism of embroidery. And just finally, this is to end on a positive note rather than showing you losses in the paint or changes. We looked at this painting to see whether this had lost some red, but looking by chance at this and thinking that it might be one of the normal mixed purples that we've been finding in paintings because of lack of purple, we found fluorite, very rarely found, comes from the mountains in Tyrol, we might be finding it, we might be on the tip of an iceberg, we might be finding it again. But it's been used and again, this is a second finding, just very recently, found in not only in the black of this costume, but also little specks of it in the ruff, in the white of the ruff. Purple specks in the ruff. I don't know, haven't even had a chance to think about what that means. And then finally, this portrait we looked at before it was conserved. It's been under conservation. It's going to be in the exhibition here at the British Museum. So you'll be able to see it restored. This is before it was restored. I was looking at it to see whether this 5 o'clock shadow was actually just the underlying grey imprimatura coming through and forming a shadow. But actually, looking at it, examining it, we found that it was a layer on top. And so it was an original 5 o'clock shadow to make him look more romantic and beautiful at age 23. And if you look at it, when you look at it, have a look at this wonderful spread of threads here, and the beautiful twist of the tiny brush stroke as it depicts these threads. And perhaps think about one of his poems, like The Bracelet or whatever, this portrait made for his lover. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Libby. We're going to take a couple of questions. We've run a little beyond time, but I think it would be appropriate at this point to see if there are any questions from the audience. We have a couple of microphones, one on either of the side aisles. If you'd like to ask a question, if you perhaps just raise your hand and then wait for the microphone. Yes. Could you just wait? Because others, we will hear you, but others won't.
Okay. The portrait of Elizabeth holding the serpent looks as though she's much older than 1580, and the fact that she's holding a serpent, that's the emblem of the Earl of Essex.
Yes, you may be right. One thing about her looking older is that the paint from the other painting beneath, if you remember, there's a painting of her face, is her flesh goes over the neck of the other, the underlying painting, and the neck has quite a dark area of background underneath it, and so it's tending to come through. It shows rather badly through, so she looks actually rather disfigured on the surface by that. So that might make her look a bit older, but that's a very interesting point. Yes, thank you.
In Covent Garden, there's a pub called the Essex Arms. It has the serpent on the side.
Yes, of course, yes. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, can I ask you, the green verditer that you found and the recommendation not to use it, but was that recommendation perhaps in miniature paintings where it might be in more intimate contact with the substrate and might do damage, whereas in oil paintings, with there being a priming layer underneath, there might be an isolation of that damaging effect?
Yes, that's true. That might be the reason, but yes, I think that he was much more careful when he was talking about the not letting your dandruff go on the painting and all that sort of thing. But I think that I've seen it so rarely used on oil paintings that I think it must have been generally seen as not a good thing, but just very tempting because it's such a beautiful green. And malachite, the natural form of that green, was very difficult to get hold of and difficult to handle. So, yeah.
Yes, in the sort of third row back.
The silver leaf you were talking about, is the entire painting panel covered in silver leaf?
Sorry.
You were talking about a portrait, and it had some silver.
Yes.
You said, is the entire panel
it's actually
covered in silver leaf, or is it just that small
just
bit?
Just in the area of, are you thinking of the peak?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's actually on canvas, which makes it extraordinary. But it's just under the curtain, and we think that it's a reference to the earlier one that I showed of the other Protestant king, because after all he was going to be a Protestant king, Henry Prince of Wales. So we think that it's a very old-fashioned thing to do at that point in 1590, the 1590s, to use silver leaf. So art historians at the National Portrait Gallery have thought that it's a reference to that other portrait, that earlier portrait.
There's one more question further along that row, and then I think probably we ought to draw to a close.
You had a Dunwich Picture Gallery picture.
Sorry,
Is it working? Am I speaking?
Perhaps you could just put it a little closer
A
to
bit
your
closer,
mouth.
is that better? You showed a picture from Dulwich Picture Gallery. I happen to know that gallery quite well. And I don't know if you know, there's a pine-acre, which is 17th century, obviously, and it has in the foreground some very large leaves, sort of Gunnar type.
Yes.
And they've turned blue. And it's always said that it's because the yellow lake, I think, has faded. But it always strikes me as peculiar because the huntsman in it has blue sleeves.
Yes.
Are they meant to be blue, or were they originally green as well, I'm wondering? Do you know
The huntsman has a blue jacket. Is that what you're saying?
He has a jacket with sleeves which are now blue.
Yes, exactly.
Would they have originally been green? Do you know this picture?
I do. I know the painting quite well because I took a sample from that blue on the leaves many years ago when it was being conserved. And in fact, I found on the top of the ultramarine chalk, which is the base. Often a yellow, organic yellow, is precipitated onto chalk as a base to make it work as a pigment. And so we think that the yellow lake was actually glazed over the blue originally. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that the blue of the huntsman's sleeves are in ultramarine, and they should have shown up beautifully, but now it's a little bit difficult to read them because, of course, these massive blue leaves in front instead. So I mean, one thing about technical art history is that we are finding out about things like that show us what the original composition would have been and what the artist intended the focus to be on that painting of the huntsman, of the little huntsman.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the questions from the floor. And could we all again, to conclude, thank Libby for the presentation.